Peace. You are tuned into Edible Activists with your host and favorite edible activist, Melissa L. Jones. On this show, we honor Black people and their stories in food and agriculture, celebrating legacy, traditions, contributions, and creativity that all stem from the land. So tune in and let's get started. Peace, y'all. This is your host and favorite edible activist, Melissa L. Jones. I've got a new guest on the show, Ora Kemp, the voice behind the Bodega Bites. She's a fierce food equity advocate, making sure everyone's eaten. Ora is also a 2025 Castanea Fellow and serves as Senior Policy Advisor with the NYC Mayor's Office of Food Policy. Ora, welcome to the show.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited about this. I'm giddy. I am. I've been following your platform, more recently, and I love the nature in which you present this information, all things food equity and serving updates and serving, the folks what they need to hear. And so I'm excited to dive into your platform, the Bodega Bites. And on this show, we love a good origin story and how you got into this world, and it's never linear. As I always say, nothing is ever linear. So we're going to start off with what inspired you to create the Bodega Bites, which I love. Former NYCer over here, okay? Shout out to literally, I feel like I lived in all the boroughs, but love the bodega. And so just want to know what inspired the platform, the name, and, and what conversations, you're hoping to spark, as you talk to folks about all things food and equity.
Yeah, the Bodega Bites. Social media hasn't always been a space where I felt comfortable sharing and thriving, but during the pandemic, I find myself wanting more community. And, since I've been in New York, which has been for about 8 years now, I have lived in the Bronx. This is where my mom was born and raised. This is where my grandmother was raised. And there's been a lot of change in the Bronx, but one thing that stayed the same is the staple of the corner store, the bodega, and as a standard New York City staple. And when I moved to the neighborhood, I realized that was the most abundant place for me to get access to food. They're on almost every single corner. That's the most accessible place to go. But access to a green market or access to the grocery store wasn't as robust. And I was working for a nutrition education program at the time that was funded through SNAP-Ed New York State. And when I was there, I had all of this, skills, all of this education and all this work that I had done in the past that taught me how to cook for myself. And then I was in a neighborhood where I was challenged every single day to figure out how to put those puzzle pieces together. And I found the bodega was a great place for me to go to just grab random ingredients, almost like a mystery basket style, try and throw together a meal. And a friend of mine was like, you should just start posting this on TikTok. That's what this is for. You can put in little videos and people from your neighborhood can see it and they can figure out how to also put these puzzle pieces together. So I started the Bodega Bites making little videos where I was just hungry. And I was like, let me go to the bodega. Let me just film my journey at the bodega. And I'd grab a couple of ingredients here and there and I'd show what I'd make with it. And I realized one day I was on the bus, I was headed to my office and a guy on the bus was like, you're the Bodega Bites, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, mama, I made it. And it was one of those moments where I just realized wow, people are actually, they're functionally, they're relating to this content. It's relevant to what they're doing. And we all understand what it's like when we're trying to stretch our food dollars, do what we can to put a meal on the table. But the majority of what we have is quick convenience foods. At the time that I started the Bodega Bites, the South Bronx had a bodega to grocery store ratio of 32-1. There were 32 bodegas for every one grocery store. It's gotten better now. I think we're somewhere in the low 20s, and it's slowly getting better. But the realization that a neighborhood is constructed strategically with access to things and also restrictions on other things, and even with all my skills, all of my knowledge, I was still trying to put the pieces together So I knew that other people were experiencing that same kind of work, and I wanted to give a resource to support with that.
I love that so much. The bodega. I mean, you would agree though, and that's a crazy ratio. And I believe it. Like there's a bodega everywhere in New York City, right? And but a staple of the New York City, of most of New York, of all New York City communities, right? Like I mean, it's no different. You know, here we might not call it a bodega in DC or elsewhere, right? As the corner store. But it is like your staple, store that you go to pick up a few things. Now, I will say that when I was living in New York, not to make this about me, I was able to go in the bodega, get me a mango or something like that, my little Guinness, something a little special. But I love that because I also think it's super important to, especially it's the food space can be extremely complex, but to be able to break it down in bite-sized pieces, like no pun intended, to be able to like create a platform that's really resonating, especially for the folks in that community, it's like super important. And so I think you've just been doing an amazing job in doing that. And so I also just would have been wowed out if I saw you on the bus too. Or so you're a star. There you go. And so, though, like I've lived in New York and I lived in most of the boroughs, right? And I know that they're all different. And I'm always interested in learning, and still it's changed. I mean, I lived in New York City years ago, but like the landscape is always changing. But in terms of like the food landscape itself, and let's actually just stick to the Bronx. Like your family's from the Bronx, you've been in the Bronx. Are you able just to give us like a view of like what the food landscape in the Bronx is like when it comes to food equity? Yes, there's like I think you mentioned all the ratio, the bodegas, but what are some of the other stats that folks might not be aware of in the Bronx specifically, or any other borough you want to call out?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people would be familiar with the Not 62 campaign. They looked at all of the counties across the state and they ranked them based on health outcomes, and the Bronx came dead last, 62 of 62. And that's because of a lot of different things. Community construction and what you have access to is definitely a big piece of that. But it's led to statistics. And I think it's always important to note that like statistics are descriptions of an experience, linked to people. It's not indicative of people inherently, right? There's a really interesting assessment that came out from the Helmsley Trust and Measure of America. They did what they called a portrait of New York City. And they said the 5 New Yorks, they came up with this score, Human Development Index score. And it allowed them to quantify data at a bunch of different levels, essentially equated to a score from 1 to 10, 1 being the worst health outcomes, the shortest lifespans, the most economic burden, and 10 being the greatest health outcomes, the longest life expectancy, the greatest like wealth generation, things like that. And then they put it over a map of New York City, specifically the transit map, and they assigned each stop along every transit line a specific score based on the health of the people in that neighborhood. And the South Bronx, where I am, have like a 3, like a 3.2 or a 3.4, something along those lines. And then if you just take the 6, a couple stops into the Upper East Side, all of a sudden you're in an 8, 9. And you're like, what is causing these massive differences in health outcomes? And it's about neighborhood, it's about construction, it's about the communities that we live in. And people in the Bronx, 70% of folks in my neighborhood use public transportation. So when there are delays on the train and things aren't running like they should be, it's mostly impacting people in the outer boroughs. They're the ones who get the brunt of it. And in the Bronx, there are massive differences in wealth. The South Bronx, for example, is one of the poorest congressional districts in the country, compared to something like further north or up by the park. Like you get these very different divides in both socioeconomic status as well as like the construction of houses, where public housing is, low income housing is. Mott Haven has the greatest amount of concrete and public housing of any neighborhood in New York City. So you start to realize that there are things that just add additional burden to people's lives. And this leads to us having some of the greatest rates of child asthma. We have major highways running right through garden and park spaces, right? We also have some of the lowest life expectancy. You can expect to live an average of 8 years less if you live in my neighborhood compared to the Upper East Side. And then you also look at things just around what we have access to when it comes to food. If we have a lot and an overabundance of things like packaged and processed food, of course, those are going to be the things that we go for when time is stretched and money is stretched. It's what we have to be able to provide ourselves with a meal. And research has started to show that the cost of food in neighborhoods that are low income are actually priced often much higher than in more affluent neighborhoods because they know that people will be leveraging benefits for their purchase and they can handle the additional costs. But with things like cuts and reductions at the federal level, it means that every single dollar that people are receiving today are going to go less. They're not going to cover as much. They're not going to cover as many meals. And with inflation and food costs going up as much as they have over the last few years, everybody can use every dollar that they have. The more that we integrate things like green markets, walkable spaces, more trees and green space to reduce the temperature in our neighborhood and less burden on electricity and all of these things, like we need to think about making neighborhoods more livable. We need to think about the biggest differences. I stayed at a friend's house recently and dogs sat for them. They live in Chelsea and it was beautiful. Like you're able to walk along the water, there are connected pathways, there are bike lanes, there are parks everywhere, tree coverage everywhere. And you realize like this is what a neighborhood looks like when it's well invested in. We have so many people who keep our city running, living right here in the Bronx. And we have the greatest rates of food insecurity, some of the highest rates of heart disease, and the lowest life expectancies. So it's really tough when you realize that people work very hard and you just want a good quality life. And you realize that requires investment, and neighborhoods that aren't invested in aren't able to provide that kind of stability to the people who live there.
Thank you for breaking that down. And New York City is it's one of the best cities, I feel like, I'll say. But it's just interesting because even with all that said, we have more people wanting to come into the city, right? And that's like all over the place because you are priced out in the places that were already expensive before, right? So even trying to go to somewhere like further out in the Bronx or further out in Brooklyn, like it's just there's more people, and it's I feel like all the things that you were saying, like the things that are coming up in my mind are more people, like this crazy energy gridlock that is insane, right? Like the inflation, like the food prices, the housing prices, and what is happening? Like what is going to happen? Like that is just like the big question, you know? And there's like more and more people. I mean, even the same thing for DC, you know, more people wanting to come into the city, same issues, different landscape, you know? So all that was just coming up for me as you were talking and breaking down the landscape of New York City and the Bronx. And so it's all unfortunate. And with that, and we're gonna dive a little bit into this big, beautiful bill. And the reason why I want to do that is because I watched, you know, I know in quotes for y'all can't see this, but I had my little quote fingers up or quotes, right? You know, I feel like and what I want to talk to with the bill is more so like around SNAP, because you had made a post recently that I've actually listened to like over and over because I was like, Ora's breaking this thing down. She's not playing. We got to get to the bottom of this, you know. But like places like bodegas, like what? Because I mean, I even think as someone who's actually been a former recipient of SNAP, right? Like going to a co-op like in my neighborhood, and not all of them, right? But being able to get a discount even still further on my groceries because I've been a SNAP recipient, right? So, like, and I know there's like lots of things being put in place in New York City and like other places, but like, is there a bigger role that bodegas or just even other corner stores have played, or like, or that's something that's in play, or just has the opportunity to do that because like there's so much at stake?
Yeah, and it's smart to leverage the resources that you already have in a community to bring in the things that you need, right? Bodegas are trusted spaces, so having the opportunity, like many of them now accept SNAP dollars, they'll carry at least some small amount of like very common produce, tomatoes, cucumbers, avocados, mangoes, things like that, right? You can always get those because they're also considered shelf stable, or at least more stable than other kinds of like leafy greens, herbs, seasonal veggies. And that's the risk that a lot of bodega owners have to take in getting product that might not move as quickly, because it also requires, a lot of people don't realize this, like healthier food is great, but it also requires additional time. No matter what, if you're getting ingredients, and this is coming from somebody who lives in an ingredients household, like it requires additional time, right? So if you're already working multiple jobs to make sure that you can keep these skyrocketing electrical bills covered and a roof over your head with rents going up so much faster than cost of living adjustments. You really have to hustle. And in order to do that, it often means you have less time, and you're living in an outer borough, which means you're commuting further to get to work, right? So all of these things compound to needing to leverage your dollar for the greatest convenience, right? That's what it buys you. It buys you time. So when you're going into your bodega, that dollar is incredibly important, and bodegas rely on SNAP dollars. They rely on people coming in and using their benefits to get food there. And in New York City specifically, for every $1 that's spent on SNAP, it's $1.70 in economic return for the city. So we're amplifying those dollars when they're spent here locally with our local bodega owners, with our local shop owners, keeping those dollars localized. That's what's most important. Now, we know that SNAP dollars right now underneath this big, every time I hear something, I don't even like calling it that. I'm like, this big, bombastic, ridiculous bill. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just so I talk about it, I just get so mad. Oh my goodness, because it is taking away like the safety net while not having anything effective to replace it. I will be the first to tell you that I don't think things like supplemental dollars to purchase food and supporting emergency, like having a massive industrial emergency food network is the solution. It's a band-aid, and it's one that we've been using. A question that I would often ask is, we have in New York City, we have roughly 1.4 million people who are food insecure, right? And I have seen more recent estimates that are pushing it to more like 1.7 million. But you have to remember, a lot of these numbers are delayed. They're based on data that's collected like 2 years ago. So it's hard when food cost is changing between 5 and 10% year to year. Like, it's hard to say like exactly what it is today. But we know that more people are tapping into the emergency food network. We hear it from them every single day. They're having to turn people away. They're distributing all the food they have and don't have resources to purchase more. So it's like we're seeing this expansion in need. So I would estimate that around like one in four New Yorkers are experiencing some kind of food instability, right? And that is a massive part of our population. That is a tremendous number of people, especially when the majority of them are working. A lot of folks don't realize that the majority of SNAP recipients are working. There's a work requirement. There's always been a work requirement. But the big bodacious bill has changed the rules around what and who constitutes as needing a work requirement. So let's break it down. The first thing that they say is the allotment that you get on your card, the dollars that go onto that card. It's normally funded by the federal government. They are now saying the state also has to pay part of that amount. And the amount that you have to pay is based off of your state's error rate. So every single state is different. They've broken it into brackets. For New York City, we have to pay 10% of the total benefit cost, 15% of the total benefit cost, because our error rate is over 10%, right? So here's like, that is going to equate to billions of dollars over a 5-year cycle. And on top of that, they're also saying that the state has to cover more of the administrative costs. So the benefit itself is one thing, but like the screening, the processing, the tracking of the dollars going onto the cards, the verification that has to happen every single year, all of those are covered underneath administrative fees. And the federal government pays 50% of that, and the state pays the other 50%. The federal government is now saying, you guys have to cover 75%. We're only going to cover 25%. And that additional administrative cost is $266 million for the state of New York. In total, we have to come up with about $2 billion just to keep the program running as it is right now. No changes other than how it's running right now. In addition to the change in who's paying for the benefit and admin costs, they've also said, when Biden was in office and he updated what's called the Thrifty Food Plan, they used the cost of the Thrifty Food Plan to determine how much your household receives based on how many people, their age, how much food they need. They quantify that in a per meal cost using a Thrifty Plan, like looking at staple food items, which prior to Biden coming in hadn't been updated for decades. So we were still calculating that based off of food costs from way far back. Food doesn't even cost the same amount that it did 5 years ago. So the fact that this isn't being updated every single time the farm bill is updated is already pretty wild. But they decided to roll back what Biden had implemented with the cost adjustment. So typically they allow for inflation adjustment. for the food dollars to at least keep them consistent. But they don't allow for, if they decide not to adjust it 1 year, it wouldn't allow them to then like do it later, retroactively, make that additional adjustment. They're like, no, 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 you can only go up by the amount of inflation in a single year. So that means that people are going to be getting less dollars already immediately. It's going to roll back your dollars that you receive, and you're going to be able to purchase less per dollar than you could last year. In addition to all of those changes, the work requirement, which still stands, essentially underneath SNAP, you have to work for at least 3 months out of a 12-month calendar year to qualify for the benefit. If you're unemployed for longer than 3 months, you can no longer receive the benefit, especially if you haven't been like looking for a job or doing a job training or going through some kind of a program, right? So that used to be folks between the age of 18 and 54 would have to maintain that employment of more than 3 months a year. They have now said that you have to be 18 to 64. So they've added 10 more years to that. So if you're someone who has been receiving SNAP, but you've been out of work for the last 3 years because you were over that age requirement, you now have to go back to work for another 6 years. But you've just been out of the field for 3 whole years. You have a gap of 3 whole years. And we already know how difficult the job market is right now with all of the federal layoffs, all the cutbacks in funding, all these things, right? So in addition to that, they've also now said it used to be if you have an able-bodied with dependents. So if you're an able-bodied adult and you have dependents, they used to say that you, as an individual, if it was a single-parent household, could continue receiving SNAP without having to exceed the 3-month employment period if your child is under the age of 18. So if you're someone who takes care of a child at home, like you can have alternative or part-time employment and still get benefits. They have now reduced that from 18 years old to 14 years old. So if you have a 14-year-old, you now have to go back to work full-time employment in order to continue receiving your benefits. So there are just like a lot of changes in like the nuance of the program. That means people are going to be getting less dollars. They're going to have more work requirements, and the state is going to have to cover more of the cost to continue running and operating the program. Now, mind you, New York State already pays more into the federal pot than it receives in benefits. So now we have to cover even more, plus the continued increase, the continued payments towards the federal, and the increase in the tax obligation from individuals with the new tax plan. While they're also doing all of this, they completely eliminated SNAP Ed, which is the educational arm of SNAP. So you get the benefits, you get the dollars. We already know having the money is just one part of it. You also have to have the knowledge, the skills, the ability to actually prepare that food. And that was delivered through SNAP Ed. Now, you heard me when I started. When I first moved to New York, it was with the SNAP Ed program. When I was at New York Common Pantry, I had a team of 13 people. We were all fully funded underneath the SNAP Ed program. We were able to get additional grants from Cabrini and the Gus Schumacher Nutrition Incentive Program to build on initiatives like our Food as Medicine program, where we identified folks within the pantry population that already had a chronic disease related to diet and provided them with additional produce and intensive nutrition and education and intervention. And it was incredibly effective. We were able to diversify the funding for that program through initiatives like that. And now all of SNAP Ed is gone. And many of these programs like GusNIP require that you already have an established and steady line of funding for that program. If you eliminate SNAP Ed, that continuous line of funding is gone. That's a 5-year contract, multi-million-dollar contracts that they're eliminating in year 3 and completely getting rid of. And so now it puts other funding in jeopardy. To think about the entirety of organizations that build themselves up to meet the specific needs of the people in their community, and then all of a sudden the funding for all these things are being cut. It's dismantling the system that is meant to support people just to help them sustain. You're dismantling the entire thing without having another option, another resolve in place to fill the gap, to fill the void that's being caused by this. It's probably one of the most concerning things. Like, who's going to fill that gap? Who's going to do that?
That is the quote unquote, the not even a fraction, it just a a small speckle of the big, beautiful bill. And I mean that in quotes. And it will get to a point. I mean, it's already like that now, right? But even for like working like class, like families, or just, even if you do have a certain AMI or above a certain threshold, energy bill, food, my rent, food. And it's so sad to have to choose between the 2, or choose between a plethora of things. And so it really is unfortunate. I do wanna go back because, you know, you actually had broke down a definition that I really do wanna speak to in terms of, food insufficiency, which I've in theory, like, you kinda know about it, right? But the way that you broke it down, I'm like, "Damn, like, let's talk about it here versus food insecurity," because the food insufficiency is affecting folks like me, who makes a salary, and we're like, "Oh my gosh, rent high, food high, electric bill high, it's hot outside," like, and so I really want you to break that down before the audience because this is not just impacting those that we think it would impact, just low to, income or underserved neighborhoods, like, this is everybody, baby, most of everybody, if you're not that 1% or whatever that percent is, like, this is everybody beneath that, and I'm in that category, let's be clear.
Listen, I am too. Like I honestly, I think about this all the time, and I'll start by just sharing a little story. So when I got into the Castanea Fellowship, it comes along with a stipend to help invest for your professional development and your care, like all these things. And I asked so many questions. I was like, so I can use this money however I need to use this money, because I was thinking like I can go grocery shopping and get whatever I want. Like that's what the first thing that my mind went to. And I went to Trader Joe's, and I always like prep this list, and I have like my approved, like my meals planned out, and try and cross reference to make sure that I'm using all the ingredients throughout the week so nothing goes to waste. And I was standing in, I just gotten like the first installment of my stipend, and I just sat there and looked at it in my bank account because I'd never seen that many zeros in my bank account. I was like, oh, I was so excited. So I was like, I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to touch it. It's like, but you're supposed to invest it in yourself, right? So here I am in Trader Joe's, my little listy list in front of me, and I'm ready to cross things off. And I'm standing there, I'm looking at this list, and I'm like, girl, I got money now. I'm like, I don't need no list. I just need my desire and an appetite. Like I had a moment of reflection, and I sat there and cried in Trader Joe's because I realized it was the first time in my life I could have gone to that store and bought everything that I wanted and never come close to spending the money that I had in my bank account. And I was like, this is what it feels like to be food secure. You don't have to meal prep unless you want to. You don't have to plan things out. You don't have to budget. You don't have to do anything. You just got it. And there are a lot of people who have that freedom, and they don't even realize what a blessing it is. And in the same exact city, you can have people like me who are doing things to try and improve the conditions that people have around their food. And I'm in Trader Joe's counting my pennies to make sure that I can actually get the meals that I want for the week. Right. So I fall into a category that I call food unstable. Food unstable. Like I'm experiencing food instability. It's not that I am without, and it's not that I have a fear of not having food. I know I can go and get it if I need to, but I have to constantly manage my budget and balance with everything else that I'm doing. Because, like you said, girl, that rent, that utility bill hits, and I need to be frugal. I need to be mindful of how it is that I'm spending my. So I'm very aware of my budget, and I do things to adhere to it. But I know that if by chance I overspend or something, I'm going to be okay. But I need to be mindful of it. That is the privilege of having this fellowship has provided me like something that I've never experienced before. So that's like what I would call food unstable, unstable. And then there is food insecure, and the biggest difference that I would say between food insufficiency and food insecurity is one of them happens over a prolonged period of time, and one is more like a flash in the pan here and there, but it happens in a pretty patterned way where you start to develop coping mechanisms to manage what you got going on, right? So a food insecure household is going to be one that they have resources to get food. They'll purchase food. They're able to eat their meals. They don't have much choice. So usually the greatest determining factor of the food that you choose is going to be the price of the food. Not so much like whether or not it's organic, not if it's like the specific kind of flavor you want or this or that. It's going to be predominantly like, how much does it cost? Do I have that? Is a good way of kind of describing food insecure. A lot of the choice and autonomy is gone. Um, On top of that, you'll develop these coping mechanisms that are usually like you'll have a meal, but you'll split it in two just to help it last longer. Or like me, you will not want to throw food away. I know that this is like part of my experience, but girl, we don't waste food here. We don't do that. Okay. We eat it all, either today or tomorrow as breakfast, like it's getting eaten. Okay. So there's like an increased level of like value and scrutiny around your food and what you do with it. And you want to make sure you eat all of it, which is why people will tend to go towards foods that taste good because they know they'll eat all of it over foods that might be healthy for you, but might not satiate you in the same way. Then you have food insufficiency. Food insufficiency is when you don't have material resources to ensure the continuity of your meals. Food insufficiency is the kind of thing where you start to worry about whether or not you're going to have like enough money to get more. You start to kind of like move around money a bit differently because you know that it might be scarce. And food insufficiency is also interesting because it's starting to bleed into different socioeconomic levels in a way that we really haven't seen before. So, for example, the New York State Health Department did an analysis about 2 years ago that looked at household food insufficiency across New York State. So, not just like food insecure, like did you have enough food to last you over the last 60 days? Were there times when you didn't have enough food or you had to like spread your meals out over a longer amount of time? Getting further than that and asking the questions of did you have enough money? Did you ever question whether or not you had money to be able to get you access to food? It's when you start to think about your material resources in a different way. And they found that people are starting to be food insufficient at higher income levels, like going up to making $100,000. All of a sudden now you were thinking about your food in a different way. And I saw this in a few times when I worked at the pantry, specifically when the government had shut down for about 3 or 4 months. And there were people who were like doctors and scientists working for the government, and they were coming to the pantry line. They had previously volunteered there, so they knew that the food we were providing was good. And when they needed it, they came out because they had been out of work for so long. Or during the pandemic, when people were laid off for an extensive amount of time, people who had never thought about going to a pantry before were now going to pantries because it was the first time that their material conditions started to be questioned, whether or not they had the financial stability to actually provide for themselves. And more people are experiencing that. As the cost of living goes up, but our incomes stay relatively stagnant, the rate of inflation that we're experiencing right now is grossly outpacing our wages. And on top of that, you have things like community displacement. So in New York City, especially, like they always think the solution is to just invest more, to provide for more private industry to come into public spaces and invest. And that has to be done in some sense, semblance of balance between the needs of the community and the needs of the city in this kind of perpetual growth that it is always going after. And when you do something like open up a community pantry or neighborhood pantry, it takes years to get that established, to build that up, to build the trust in the community. If a community can be completely gentrified within a matter of years, but it might have taken 20 years for that pantry to get up and established and to get the community to really trust it. But now the neighborhood is completely different. But you can't just move a pantry as easily, and people don't all move to the same neighborhoods. So like it's a challenge to build the environment in the way that you need it, but a direct way that we can intervene and immediately address food insecurity and insufficiency is by making sure that people have the money that they need to provide for themselves the nutritious, culturally relevant food that promotes their health in any neighborhood that they live in. That's what we could do right now.
And this is all while making sure you have enough protein on your plate, making sure you have enough fiber on your plate, like not even getting to that part, like making sure that you're getting nutrient dense food or getting the recommended amount of nutrients and protein that you need, right? It is just like buying the food. And it really is, it is really super unfortunate because everything that described, and even as someone, who makes a, sufficient salary, and like I live in an expensive ass, apartment, and the rent is going up. It is just so true. And it's just like I feel like every minute you walk into a grocery store and I'm like, nachos are like $6 now when they never used to be that way. But as many of you amazing advocates, who in food champions point out it's not just the food thing, it's just setting up a grocery store. It is the income, like the incomes aren't meeting the demands in which the housing is going up. And then we have this whole electric crisis, with the grid being like on lock and in weak at the same time. But like it's the cost is going up. I mean, like heck, like Pepco sent out email to all DC residents going up by 18%. And so it's not just a linear, thing and not just one size fits all. It's all of these spokes in the wheel, that contribute to all of this. And so I'm really concerned. I mean, I've been concerned, but like this is definitely a point in history where I'm just like, damn, and which leads me into my next and final question is, this is the work that you do day to day, right? So you had the Bodega Bites, and like and this is your world. And so, what does the scenario planning look like? Or like it is me? I'm just like, scoot over, mom and dad. Like, and it's like it's funny to me, but it's not funny to others who do not have that option. So also, let's just be real. Like some people don't have that privilege. Some people do not have that option, because it's real out here. But what does the scenario planning look like? It's like goodness, like the SNAP benefits are being reduced. There isn't education, which is a whole nother layer to it to actually know how to cook the food. What do you do with the food? Do you have a place to live to cook the food in? Do you have the proper resources? And so like what does that look like for everybody? So we're all grouped in, again, like everyone is experiencing, challenges on different, levels and degrees, but like what is that scenario planning looking like for us in the coming months?
I often come back to like, what is the goal? Like, what would be the ideal conditions for all of us to be in? It's like where you are stable, where you are safe, where you are fed, where you have a semblance of community, you can rely on those around you. But most importantly, like there's a security to it. I feel like the hardest part of all that's going on right now is there are so many unknowns in places where we should have stability. Um, but there is an attack on like basic needs. Uh, this is something, I'm part of the right to food community of practice, and something that we are working towards right now is like doing constitutional amendments for rights to food across states, because the UN, they'll every once in a while they'll vote on whether or not the participating countries believe that food is an inherent human right, and every single time the US is like, nah, we don't think that, and it shows, right? Like of all the other nation states that are involved, the US is the only one of two. The US and Israel are the only ones who are like, nah, you guys don't have a right to food. And it's represented in how we treat people. Like if we really wanted for people to go into the workforce, to be committed to their work, to drive innovation, we would make sure that we're meeting their needs. And this carries through both on a localized scale here in New York City, when we're thinking about community displacement, people, neighborhoods getting gentrified, and people being forced out who've been there for generations. That's because we're chasing the bag. And maybe we need to be thinking more about reinvesting in the neighborhoods that we have, keeping things stable, because there's also a huge issue of talent drain from the outer boroughs, where these incredible people who could do phenomenal work to reinvest and build a better neighborhood are being forced to go somewhere else, to move out of their neighborhood to get the opportunities that they should have right here in New York City. Like this city is built on the ideal of opportunity and being able to grow here, yet the people who were born and raised here don't have the opportunity to do that because they're getting priced out, which is why I think it's incredibly important to focus on that. We used to say, you have to focus on kitchen table issues when you want to run for office. And yet now we're talking about investing in AI, even if it means poisoning people's water and cutting veterans' benefits, even though we want them to continue going into military service. The entire Maha report was centered around this idea that we don't have enough able-bodied young people to go into military service. It wasn't even about, we have an obesity epidemic, which is going to lead to higher healthcare costs. It's going to lead to a shorter quality, a shorter lifespan and less opportunity. Like, they didn't focus on any of that. They were like, we need soldiers, and y'all can't do that because you're overweight. But then they take away the nutrition education program and the benefits that would help people actually get access to better food. There's the way that we represent our values is very clear and apparent, and we need to transition our values. So things that I so you mentioned like moving home with your parents. Moving home, my mom has been bribing me to move home. She's like, it's so much safer here. We have a pool. You can live here. We got you. And I'm like, you know what? This I went home for the holidays and I was like, oh, this is nice. Like, yes, I do want to be here. You're right. Like, but that means I would also live in the state of Kentucky, in which if I were ever some man on the street tried to take advantage of me and I end up pregnant, I would not have access to an abortion. I would not be able to access my own care. I have less rights, less autonomy over my own body just by living in that state versus living here. And that's the trade off, right? I'm essentially paying to maintain my rights as a human being by living in New York, right? So, yes, like sometimes moving is an option, but I really wish that people would understand that New York City is truly on the front lines of so many things. I would think it was Corey Bush that framed the term of like frontline communities. It's often used to describe climate change in the neighborhoods that experience what they call worst and first. Like they have the first impacts and the worst of it because they don't have as many resources to combat climate change. And she used it often to describe the conditions of people living within very strained socioeconomic neighborhoods in which we're told that an affordable house in our neighborhood. I think I built like 7,000 new high-rise apartments along the waterfront down here, and they called it an affordable studio for $3,000. That is 10% of what someone in a family of four in my neighborhood brings home in the entire year. And you guys are saying that's affordable? Like, and that's because it's based off of citywide AMI. That's based off of everybody across all 5 boroughs combined. And Manhattan skews that grossly towards a higher income range compared to the outer boroughs. So, like, we need things to really be centered in what it is actually like for people experiencing all of these things, the worst and the first on the front lines of some of our greatest social challenges. I'm in New York where uh, the retaliatory tariffs from Canada are going to come in and increase our bills, utility bills by 25%. 25%. Like it might mean that I have to cut back on a few more things in order to accommodate that. But that's not everybody has that ability. Not everybody has the ability or option to do that. There aren't enough resources for the folks who need it because it's being hoarded by the people who have too much. We need to reinvest in our communities. We need to reinvest in the neighborhoods that are like always here. When people come and go from New York City, they have the ability to do that, but not everybody does, myself included. If I really needed to, I could go back home with my mom. I could move back in with my mom. Granted, I wouldn't love living in a state where I don't have rights over my own body. I could do it and I could save a lot of money to do it. But my mom left New York because she didn't see opportunity for herself here. I am here now. I chose to move back here to this place that felt familiar because I was raised by a woman who was raised by this space. I feel at home here. I look around my neighborhood, people look like me. I get to mingle with, I get to know my neighborhood. I teach yoga or coffee shop. I know all the folks there. Like this is truly like community. And we deserve to invest in one another. And I think alternatives to the system that is in place, all of the uncertainty that we're feeling right now is the rapid change at the federal level. So what does it mean if we start to create more localized neighborhoods and communities that don't rely on that? And it's going to be hard, especially initially, because the need is going to be so high and we're going to be very tight while we're trying to like build the structure while it's in place and while it's being leveraged for the benefit of our neighbors. But we got to do something. And I think, we can start by making sure that New York City is protected. We have an election coming up this year. We could vote for somebody who's really invested in improving the conditions for people who make this city move, the people who keep the city alive. We can invest in walkable cities. We can invest in more bike paths, more tree coverage. I think congestion pricing was great. And I don't care if they'll give me heat for that because I know what it's done for both things like transit times and bus times that all of us pay for in our public tax dollars, right? It also improved things like air quality. It even improved the temperatures. The city cooled off by having less cars coming through it. New York City is one of the most densely populated cities on the planet. Why isn't it more walkable? Why isn't it more walkable? Why don't we have more walkable cities? Stop the attack on cyclists and encourage more bike-centric or solo bike isolated pathways. Turn one avenue in each borough into a bikes-only road. and just see how greatly that changes the overall quality of life for people across the city. And I think it's really important for us to talk about things like income inequality, because none of these things are going to happen if we're going to criminalize poverty and criminalize mental health, but then not offer access to healthcare and tell people that the only time that they can get food or the resources that they need is if they go and labor for someone else is crazy to me. That's great. You're making a systems failure an individual responsibility to correct, and it doesn't work that way. If people were able to name their own price when they go into work to have all their needs met, it'd be a very different environment. But we don't have those controls in place. A very easy thing the federal government could do is increase the federal minimum wage, allow for cities and states to also increase the federal minimum wage. We haven't increased the federal minimum wage in over 20 years. It is still $7.25, which means we're encouraging exploitation of labor. They're trying to get kids into the labor force. They were on news today saying that they want kids to go out and pick blueberries over the summer as a summer work program. Grown adults don't even want to go out and do the work. What makes you think that a kid wants to go out and do a job that has a 35 times higher death rate than like it's just crazy to me. It's crazy to me that these are the solutions, all because a small group of folks want to preserve their comfort at the expense of everybody else's lives, at the expense of all of our lives, and we're all seen as expendable. Like we deserve so much better, so much better, like so much better for ourselves and so much better for each other.
I mean, let the church say amen. Let the church say amen. This is the time. And I really do feel like this. Well, it's gonna have to be local everything at this point, right? We know that federal, we just uh, and and I hope that this is the time where we can gain residents' trust back into local government, like it should have been. I'm probably jacking up the phrase by the people for the people, however that is. But I think this is the time because, you have a lot of residents who, were never tapped into local government, local community. And we need local government. We need local community initiatives. And I really hope, I mean, it's unfortunate that we have to do it like this, but like, listen, like this is the time. So everything that you just named, well, let's speak it out, and hopefully, all the efforts are amplified and put into place. And so I thank you for your time, Aura. And there's so much more we could talk about. And can you come back for part two? Like,
Listen, I can go on this for days. My mom had to create a political rant safe word for me to get me to stop because I'd go off on these tangents and she would just start screaming out, Knickerbocker, Knickerbocker. And once I heard it, I had to stop. But it's important that we talk about these things. Like, it's incredibly important that we talk about these things. And I do think that the more conversations we have about alternative solutions to the system, like we haven't tried everything, right? We're living in the creation of someone's imagination. We can imagine better than this. We can think up something better than this. And I think there are a lot of people who are willing to try something different, especially if it means that they'll be better cared for.
well, with that said, thank you again, Aura. I do want you to tell folks where to find you on social so we can tap into your opinions, your perspectives by Aura in her own words, so that we can continue to be tapped into what's happening in the New York scene, but also just around, because the impacts are affecting this entire nation. And so let folks know where to find you on social.
Yeah, so I'm out here, I'm on TikTok at the Bodega Bites. I'm also on Instagram, same name, the Bodega Bites. And if you want to get profesh, I'm on LinkedIn at Ora Kemp, MPH. Check me out. I share a lot, especially around like research and things that are happening. We just put out our 2-year progress update for our 10-year food policy plan. We're now 4 years into the total plan. Did some really great work, including like culinary trainings with the Department of Corrections, investing in our culinary staff there, bringing in healthier, culturally relevant meals. The way that you care for people when they're in the complete care of the state is a reflection of your own values. So really excited to see investment in that program. Yeah, we're doing some great things. So if you ever want to connect on those, find me there. And yeah, I'll be back for part 2. Yeah.
You heard it. We're definitely coming back for a part two. So much to tap into. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for tuning in, and peace. Thank you for listening to Edible Activists. You can find today's episode on Spotify, iTunes, and Simplecast, and follow along on all social media platforms at Edible Activists for updates. Want to support this platform? You can do so by purchasing our commerce or connecting with me about media partnerships at www.edibleactivist.com. In the words of Baba Tariq Adunu, there is no culture without agriculture. Peace.